I came to the States like the year 2000 for my rabbinical training. I have been a congregational rabbi since 2002 until 2016. And then I have been working since 2018 with Sara Koplik in this project of Sephardic heritage, in the capacity of certifying people for the state of Spain and helping people to obtain Portuguese citizenship. So my training is diverse, as Heather could notice the other day. I hold a master in Semitic languages, including Arabic and Hebrew. My master's dissertation is in Aramaic, so that's another thing. And then I have a PhD in medieval Jewish history, from everything from Spain. So, and I was a professor at Wilson College for several years, for 8 years, at the Religious and Philosophy Study Department, doing introduction to Judaism, introduction to the Bible, and one of my courses was the prophets in the Tanakh, in the Torah, in the New Testament, and in the Quran. So it was a comparison of the image of the prophets, the different prophets, in the three foundational texts.
Right, and I also have a doctorate in Middle Eastern history as well, but modern, the history of the Jewish community of Afghanistan. And we're very happy to be with you here today. Thank you so much. So I know we had, yes, Abdullah, did you want to say something?
Assalamu alaikum. My name is Abdullah Siraj. I am from Yemen. And I came here to United States 2012, 8 years ago. I used to teach Arabic in Yemen and then in Egypt. And when I came here to Albuquerque, I started work with Islamic Center. I built Arabic program there for Sunday school or for summer school. And then I teach now with Heather Switzer at UNM. Part-time. I work other time in Albuquerque Academy sometime and CNM sometime. Well, shukran. I know Maynard and Noah. Aaron. Is that Aaron? Oh, it does.
I don't know.
Yeah.
So we had two questions online, but maybe some of the people here, do you have questions for in person to start with? Or Heather, how would you like to go about doing this, Heather?
Yeah, so Zoom can be awfully hard because everybody can ends up interrupting each other sometimes. So if you want to unmute yourself, you can. If you want to type a question in the chat, you're more than welcome to. Any questions go. We'd like to put that on the table because this is an information session. So we have questions about Judaism, perhaps about Islam. These are our experts here today. And the intention of bringing people together is to try to help clear up any misunderstandings people might have. Questions you might have had that are burning about religions. And maybe I'll start in the sense that I had an issue that happened last semester where somebody got very angry with me and sent me an email basically saying that I was a Zionist Nazi sympathizer, which I thought was strange because I felt like these are inclusive. Like I didn't feel like I could be a Zionist and a Nazi sympathizer at the same time. So I would love to hear the Jewish perspective on this. I think that this particular person didn't know the terms they were using. They were just mad about a grade. And so we're just like grasping at straws. I just said, what makes you think that? And they said, oh, it's your symbol in your email. And it was like Loki horns from the Avengers. And I thought I don't really see any connection between any of these things, but then I just changed the symbol and the problem kind of went away. I don't know what was going on. But how should I have perhaps responded to something like this?
That's pretty hardcore anti-Semitism. That's pretty, that's what, it's the way that, Jews are accused of being Nazis is a way of taking persecution and shifting it, turning Zionism into a curse word when Zionism means the right of the Jewish people to have a homeland. It's kind of the hatred that's seen in many other parts of the world, but less so in the United States. And so I don't know, I personally find it very distressing. I don't think that's appropriate in a university setting. The unfortunate thing about the University of New Mexico is there's no courses on Jewish history, or there's like one, but there's nothing on Israeli history, on what Zionism actually is, on Hebrew. There's literally one lecture series where we have 2 lectures a year that come in, and that's it. So people who didn't learn about this when they're younger, there's no opportunity to learn. And that's why we're so happy to be here today, because we realize that this is a rare opportunity for us to explain the Jewish perspective in this university setting. Rabbi Jordan, do you want to elaborate?
It's point number one. I'm sorry that you got that type of email. I mean, because it's always hurtful. Point number two, for me, I agree with Sarah. It makes very clear the banality of the words. Today, I think, and I'm going to expand the horizon, that we have reached a point, and that reminds me as a historian, that reminds me of the Baroque period, when the words don't mean anything, and everything is Baroque, anything is overcharged. Those terms are overcharged, and I agree with you. I mean, that's a contradiction in terms, literally. We see, I mean,
It's just hatred.
It's hatred. And where does hatred come? As someone who works with individuals, with people, I'm going to say that hate begins at home. If we don't do the effort, normally when kids are born, when you are in first grade, in second grade, you don't distinguish black or white or yellow, brown, or any colors. All your friends, doesn't matter, are the same. When those things appear in education, we see that they appear later. And normally it's because the influence that we receive at home. So for me, the invitation, and this goes back into what university is or should be. It's about opening ourselves, learning how to think, or learning how to discourse. It's not about learning a craft and then in order to go back into the chain production to punch the numbers and to be in the production machine. For me, the university is about, and this is what I learned at university, and being a college professor, this is what I also learned from my students. It's about making us think and challenging our own tenets and challenging our own prejudices.
Right. And examining what do these words mean? What have I learned in my life? But what really happened? You know, when I was a freshman in college, I had a young woman who was from Poland. His family owned, would be in the late 80s, and her family owned a hotel. And she said, yeah, Jews used to own this hotel, but it's better that they're gone now. Everything's better now. And then later, she learned about the Holocaust because she didn't know anything about the Holocaust because it wasn't taught in communist Poland. And then she realized what had happened to the family that used to own her family's hotel and how they had been massacred. And then her perspective changed. So it's like, if you're learning, the more that you can learn, the fuller your learning about the world, it can open you up, and to see many different perspectives, it just gives a richer, you have a richer life, a richer, sense inside life, but also the way you respond to others can be with much more tolerance and compassion and understanding. And, it makes all of us better, and more peaceful world, the more we learn.
Also, I think that we learn to see the world not in opposites, binary opposites, but we discover that the world contains all these gray scales in the middle. For instance, and I'm going to go language. The interaction between Arabic and Hebrew has been constant from the medieval times. When you have in the 7th century, and sorry Heather, I'm gonna be stepping on your field. So, and Abdullah, also correct me if I say anything wrong. But when in the 7th century you have the expansion of the Islamic Empire into what we call Syria, Sham, and Iraq, you come into encounter with other cultures, especially with the Greek philosophy that was translated into Syriac. And then suddenly in philosophy, you are confronted with, you have two peoples with the Quran and the Torah, and they say, okay, now we're confronted with this knowledge, which is the Greek knowledge that confronts us, that it's forcing us to confront new questions. From there, you have a new way of thinking, you have grammar, and you have a new way of interpreting the text. So in medieval times, for Judaism, we see a lot of influence from Arabic. For instance, the way we classify Hebrew grammar follows the way you classify Arabic grammar. So we follow exactly the same patterns. We don't have masters, but we have something that we call master too. I mean, because at the end, sorry, I have two cats, so this is going to be a constant cat show. Yes, they know that when I'm in Zoom, I cannot move, so they take advantage of that. So say that. Then, for instance, we see a different way of interpreting. There is clearly a gap between textual rabbinical interpretation before the 9th century and after the 9th century. The grammar appears about 9th, 10th century at the same time that Arabic grammar is being developed. Also, for instance, we have important writers like Maimonides. Maimonides has a very important book called The Guide to the Perplexed. In what language was written The Guide of the Perplexed? Guess. Arabic. And I did the translation into Catalan for Sefer HaKuzari. Sefer HaKuzari is the book of the Kuzari, author Yehuda Levi. He is one of the big medieval Jewish poets, blah, blah, blah. We even use some of his religious poetry in religious context even today. He wrote the Sefer HaKuzari. In what language? Arabic. So, and there's an influence of Arabic thinking in medieval Jewish philosophy. When the state of Israel, now I'm gonna jump. When the state of Israel gets independence, basically, they kind of surprise, you have independence. Now you have to develop a language that is going to be administrative language. Guess what? Hebrew had no term for date. So what's the term that we use today? When you have to fill in a form in Israel, the first thing that you have to write is tarikh, which means date. So the Israeli state adopted, for instance, all the administrative language from Arabic because the Arabic had the administration behind, so adopted all that adopted all this language into the state structure, if you want. So those connections go deeper than what we think, and for me, along my journey, discovering those grays, that things are not black or white. This cohabitation has been going on for centuries. We think in terms of, I'm Spanish, so we normally think in terms of Western Europe. But we forgot that, for instance, we have a long history of cohabitation in Morocco, Algeria, Tunis, Libya, Egypt, Turkey, Syria, Iraq. Zionism was a huge, and the creation of the state of Israel was a huge perturbance in the life of those Jewish communities in North Africa and in the Middle East. So, and I can go on. That intersection was abruptly shuttered down, and today we may perceive that we are in this me or I against you, or how is that, the we versus the they, in this binary position. But again, I mean, it's when you go a little deeper, you discover these connections, and you discover that this intermingling has existed for many centuries.
Yes.
And 1947 represents that.
Right. And we know now, 850,000 people, Jews, left the Middle East, and they mostly went to Israel. And so most of the people in Israel today are Mizrahi, Eastern, or Sephardi from Spanish heritage, but North African. And most of the inhabitants of Israel are not European. And, you can hear the Judeo-Arabic in their Hebrew. And so there's a lot, things are a lot closer than we think. But there were two questions that we had. And the first question is very simple and straightforward, and I'm going to answer that one. And then I'm going to give a complicated one to Rabbi Jordan. So the first question is, somebody wrote, well, I wasn't really raised religiously, and I don't know what I think, something like, I don't know what I think about God. Would that be a problem? And I can tell you unequivocally, in Judaism, that's not a problem. The American Jewish experience is very progressive, very egalitarian. 90% of American Jews are egalitarian, meaning men and women are equal in prayer. There are female rabbis. Women read the Torah. Women's status is the same as men's status in the egalitarian traditions of Judaism, which are new. They really started about 200 years ago, but they're most prevalent in the United States. Of course, there are egalitarian traditions around the world, but really you see them very strongly in the United States. So the congregations that I grew up in, at Congregation Albert, which is Reform, Congregation B'nai Israel, which is conservative, and Congregation Nahalat Shalom, which are the three egalitarian traditions in Albuquerque, that's totally normal. We think that something like half of American Jews, might not even believe in God. And that's okay too, because, of course, Judaism is a monotheistic religion and God is important, but it's not just that. Judaism is also an ethnicity and a people. And so it's not quite like Christianity and Islam. It's a little bit different in that respect. We're an ancient people that have survived the modern world. And as a tiny minority, you have to make accommodations too, because you're always going to be in a majority community. You're always going to be with people who aren't the same as you. And so what you often find is that Jewish people know a lot about Islam and a lot about Christianity, oftentimes, because that's just what you do when you're a minority. You have to learn about the majority ways. So as far as the questioner, that's no problem at all. Everyone is welcome to learn about Judaism. Everybody is welcome in a service. The other thing about Judaism is that we don't proselytize. There isn't a push to get people to convert. That's not a thing for us. We have the person who's interested in Judaism has to come, and traditionally they would come 3 times to ask before they're even allowed to study. Because that's another difference with us. So when life gets, well, actually, even now, if any of you wanted to watch a service, you could watch it on Zoom or on Facebook. All you have to do is reach out to the community and you would be very much welcomed. And that's not a problem, and no one would try to convert you. But they would just be happy that you wanted to learn more. And so that's about it. But Rabbi Jordan, there was a much more complicated question that we received, and that was about the influence of Zoroastrianism on Judaism. And I knew only about this much about it, but I know you know a lot more. So would you please expound upon that?
Yes. Let me go in general. Do you understand what Zoroastrianism is? No. Okay. Zoroastrianism is a language. I'm sorry, a language. Sorry. Oh gosh, I'm fried. And it's only 10 a.m. Zoroastrianism is a religion. Yes. It's a religion normally from the Persian Empire. That religion, it's an Indo-Iranian religion that received its name from Zoroaster. There is a group of traditions that you can see also. There is a connection there between this religious tradition and the Hindu religious tradition. The Hindu religious tradition would represent a later development later on, years later. Zoroaster, Zarathustra, if you like opera, you will probably have heard so say Zarathustra. So Zoroaster is the big organizer or the big compiler of that religious knowledge. The basic text is going to be the Avesta, that contains a collection. The most oldest part of the Avesta is the Yasnas, which is a compilation of hymns or poetry, if you want. And that was the religion of the Persian Empire. When Judaism comes in contact with the Persian Empire is after the expulsion of Babylon, until during that period of time, during the expansion of Cyrus the Great, the Persian Empire expands towards the middle, to the stands, the Kazakhstan, and all Central Asia. Thank you, Sarah. And then it expands towards the west, towards the Shams, towards the Near East, and also even to Egypt. So we're talking about the 3rd century BCE. And during that period of time, then Judaism comes in contact with Zoroastrianism. Zoroastrianism, basically the main feature, and this is, I'm going to simplify it, but the main feature is that it distinguishes two sets of deities. So it has a complex pantheon where you have Ahura Mazda, who is the god of goodness, and Ahriman, who is the good of destruction. So you have this kind of a cosmic fight between those two forces. The forces, I know that it's going to sound like Star Wars, but you have the force of the good and you have the force of darkness. And basically you have, so where do you see that influence? That influence, for instance, can be seen in the text of Qumran. Qumran is a community in the Dead Sea, and the library was found around 1940s, 1950s. One of the books is the Book of the Battles between and this is the title, for real, the Book of the Battles between the children of the light against the children of the darkness. Where this idea of darkness equals evil and light equals goodness comes from Zoroastrianism, basically, and was not when you look through the Bible, you cannot find this type of a relationship between light, good, dark, evil. That's going to be later on. Another important change is going to be in the Middle East. The conception of time was circular, cycles. So the cycle, because you are in a rural community, you depend. If you live in the Middle East, you're going to have wet season and dry season. Like in Albuquerque, you have monsoon and nothing else. So you crops are going to depend on those cycles. So if you look at ancient religious traditions, you're going to see the cycle of the death of nature and the resurrection of nature. Baal, the story of Baal in Ugarit is about this. Then you're going to have the mysteric religions from Greece. When Zoroastrianism comes, Zoroastrianism brings a different type of perspective on time. Instead of being a circular type of time, it's a linear type of time in which time and the world has a beginning, and if something has a beginning, that thing has to have an end. So the world will come to an end. So again, not to quote any movies, but we're in apocalypse now. The destruction of the world will happen according to Zoroastrian theology. The destruction of the world will happen due to fire, or by means of fire. So we're going to be burned. That's another. So as you can see, I mean, that's going to later on pick up in Jewish tradition. And you're going to have Book of Daniel, for instance, is heavily influenced by this apocalyptic view, and that's going to be later produced in the Christian community with the Book of Revelations. That would be another influence. Then we have that would be an influence in the positive, means something that we have taken. Now, there is also a rejection of the rabbis in Judaism. As Sarah explained, in Judaism we have this idea of monotheism, one God. So there is a passage. I mean, in the prayer book, there is the first. I'm going to go technical, but in the first blessing of the Shema, when we bless God for the creation, we specifically say that God created everything, good and evil. Why the specific text, if by the rabbis written down in the first century, says that? We read in that a contraposition against this influence of Zoroastrianism. Also, remember that the basic text, one of the foundational texts for Rabbinic Judaism, which is the Talmud, was redacted during the 7th and 8th century in the area of Baghdad, of Iraq. So the academies of Pumbedita, they are located in Iraq. That's a traditional area in the Sassanid Empire, meaning the Persian Empire. So those rabbis that wrote that text, which is a foundational text for us, were really embedded in that thinking. So they adopted this kind. So one of the main consequences of that is the influence, or the influence of ethics in the Talmud. What matters is how you act. So that leads to this musar, this ethics tradition. Musar is the Hebrew term for that. This ethic traditions of behavior in Jewish religion.
Thank you.
So those are going to be like 3-4 influences that you can see of Zoroastrianism in Judaism.
Wow, that's thank you so much. I didn't know most of that either. So that was.
I mean, the influence of there is an issue there. No, as I said, normally we look at this from the Western perspective, and we have a tendency of learning what's closer to us. Those influences, I'm going to say that one of the main issues that we have there is the accessibility to the sources. Those sources are written in Pahlavi. Pahlavi is Middle Iranian. Also, Farsi today, modern Farsi, it's written with Arabic characters. Probably you know that. But before that, it was written in Pahlavi script. Pahlavi script is a derivation of Aramaic the square Aramaic script, and also it contains some Aramaic terms. Accessing Pahlavi text ain't easy. Let me be clear there. So how many people do I know, or Sarah, how many people do you know in the Jewish world that specialize in Pahlavi literature?
None. In fact, I think maybe you're the only person I know who's able to read it. That's
no, I mean I know a little more, but it goes like
very
you
rare.
only
Very
it's very rare. It's not common knowledge. Therefore, the amount of lessons or the learning that you can extract from that, or the influences that you can extract from there, is very limited, because you don't have access to the sources. The majority of rabbis that I know, they can barely distinguish between Farsi and Arabic. I mean, so you have this type of problems. So
yeah.
So there is a methodological issue there too.
Thank you. But now I know we only have 25 more minutes, and we have spent a lot of time on very complicated things and some simpler stuff. But what here? Do you have any questions? I have a little show and tell. What would you guys like to talk about? Don't be shy.
I have a question, because that's something I want to know, because in most, we are like a Muslim, we have Sunnah and Shia, or Salafiyin, but what is like 2 or 3 things important in like part of Jewish, Yes. I know the politics, but Likud and that, but in religion,
we don't have it's not, our streams of Judaism are different than Sunni and Shia. We have the group that's in the Crimean,
the Karaites.
Yemeni.
Karaites. So we used to have
because we still remember, and we still have some picture of Yemeni Jewish, and my dad and my grandfather always told me, how it used to be very good relationship between Yemeni Muslim and Jewish Yemeni, but they have all Jewish. They have Yemeni. They have yeah,
they're traditional. They're traditional.
Okay. Let me go there, because what really matters, there is no direct comparison between the groups, because each group or each religion is going to respond to the circumstances, the specific circumstances that they have at that moment. First, the first thing that I want to mention is, let's go back to the expansion during the 7th century in the Shams, in the Near East, and how this affects the Jewish community. And I'm going to go into the Karaites. Basically, you have the group of Muslims coming out of Arabia, landing in Syria. I'm sorry, I'm trying to bring a little lightness into these topics, because for me it's easy to explain, and it's easy to engage you, especially through Zoom, which is kind of boring. So basically, the Muslims, which are not the majority, I mean, this is a small group, but they get into power. They want to talk to the different religious groups. If you want to talk to Christians, to who do you talk? Bishop A, Bishop B, and Bishop C. But when you want to talk to the Jews, everybody wants to have a part in the discussion. So the Muslim ruler says, oh, no way, Jose, this is not going to happen. So I need to talk to one. No, I'm simplifying. This is very comical, but it's very practical. So you need to talk, I want to talk to one. I don't want to talk to 150 rabbis, because this is going to be craziness. Because they say, 3 rabbis, 4 opinions. And believe me, I have been a congregational rabbi, so I suffered that. So basically, the Muslim rulers determine, you are going to be Abdallah. You will be talking for the rest of us. So then Sarah says, no way. How come? We have a letter dated around 750, something like that. There is a Jewish community that complains to what we call the exilarch. The exilarch becomes by Muslim ruler. The exilarch becomes like the Jewish Pope, so to speak. So this person will be the one who will talk for the Jewish community. So that Jewish community in Tunis writes a letter to Kairouan, writes a letter to Baghdad saying, who gave you the power to be the representative for the Jewish community? We never elected you, we never voted you, we never. So that's the beginning of a separation between, a schism between what we call Karaites who don't follow rabbinical ruling, because they claim you usurped that power of interpretation from the community. So who are you? Who gave you that power? And then what we call rabbinic Judaism. Karaites today are very...
Which is everybody else. It is 99%.
Correct. I mean, the Karaite group is very small. Then later on, during time, you have a division between North and South Europe, meaning Sephardic and Ashkenaz and Italian. But this is more like a regional,
Yeah.
and also geography is destiny, basically. The fact that you are in Spain, it puts you in contact with Arab philosophy, Arab language, Arab way of behaving. You understand? But people who live in the Rhineland in Germany, they don't get into contact with that. So while in Spain we see a development it's called the second golden age, because we have new poetry. For instance, the poetry, the Hebrew poetry that we will find in Spain follows the meter of the Arabic poetry. In Hebrew, we don't have long and short vowels. We don't make a distinction between long and short vowels. But when we do medieval Hebrew poetry, we have to distinguish the meter. Long, long, short, long, long, short, long, long, short. I mean, the Qasida format. So we have, yes, there is a lot of influence, not only in the format of the poetry, but also in the theme of the poetry.
Right.
So so geography is destiny in this case. So you have two very separate rituals, because the Sephardic ritual will incorporate a lot of that poetry into the liturgy, while the northern Judaism, if you want, is much more traditional. Only the rabbis, only the Talmud. So it's very much like tunnel vision. Basically.
Let's try to wrap it up in case there's anybody else who wants to ask questions.
Yeah, sorry about that.
No. It's amazing. But really, for us, we have like regional. So there's Ashkenazi Jews,
a lot of time. You're right.
Sephardi, Mizrahi, Ethiopian. Then there's a small Italian community, but it's really much more geographical. It's not the same with the theological differences, except for the Karaite Jews, the Talmud. But it's very unusual. But come on, guys, all of you guys have been so quiet, all the students.
Or you ask about Islam too?
Oh, here we have a question.
I have a question. This is probably going to be a very big question, which we might not have enough time for. So there's mysticism in all of these traditions. I was raised Christian, but Christianity seems to have the least amount of mysticism of all of them. And I'm under the impression that Zoroastrianism has the most amount of a sort of magic and mysticism and all those kinds of like, whatever people think that is, and it influences a lot of the other regions. So where does it fall with mysticism? How does that influence the other religions? I'm mostly more interested in Islam and Judaism as opposed to Christianity.
And Maynard, let's stop for a minute and see if there's any other questions. Or do other people have questions? Gia? Oh, Noah.
Did you have a question, Gia? Oh, okay. So mine's kind of philosophical. I was talking with my husband the other day and I had this question. He said, I don't know, go ask a rabbi, which is what I'm about to do. How do I phrase this correctly? So why in Judaism, and I guess in Islam, does someone mourn for life? Now, there's prayers like the mourner's Kaddish, and there's a bunch of prayers in Islam and Hebrew, and you look at them and you listen to them and they turn to songs, and it's all about mourning, but it's done differently. Now, grief and mourning is part of the human life process, where as time goes on, it gets easier. But why in Judaism and Islam does someone mourn for life? That's what I was asking him. That's why he said, ask someone who might know more about it. So that's my question.
Wow. And are there any other questions? Those are two very amazing questions.
Ask, what does he mean by like they mourn for life? I don't understand that part.
It means remembering the dead person certainly in Judaism, every year for your entire life, you will remember the person who died at the time that they died. And you'll
Okay, so for Islam, I think you mourn the person, but you don't mourn them in the sense that they were ever taken from life too early. Because in Islam, life is not supposed to be loved. You're supposed to act in life so that you can enjoy the afterlife, because we don't see life as the final point. You're supposed to enjoy the afterlife more than anything. So I think when you mourn for someone in Islam, you mourn for them, but you don't mourn for them as if they left.
Thank you. Thank you. And anything else? We have 15 minutes, so we had.
I've got a question. If we can. This should be the last question because I'm the instructor here, but I think we need to revisit Zionism just a little bit based on the chat that we got into for the Arabian Nights class. If it's possible to clear up any misconceptions about what Zionism means, because under certain contexts, it can be a very dirty word.
Okay, so the first question is about mysticism. Jordy, I'm going to turn this over to you.
I have a doctoral dissertation on the beginnings of Jewish mysticism in the 12th and the 13th century in Spain. So we have only how long? I disagree with the statement that there is no mysticism in Christianity. I mean, you have mysticism in all religions, and the question is how you define the beast. How do you define how do you label things? And mysticism, this is the problem. And I'm gonna give you in a short sentence the whole problem. How do you explain something that is highly subjective into an objective language? Have you ever tried to explain to your partners a dream that you had this past night? The dream only makes sense to you, but you try to explain it in an objective language to someone else who was not in your brain that night. So basically, this is the conundrum of mysticism. Everything depends in the taxonomy. Everything depends on how you label things. So I'm going to stop there. Because I can go from there. But yeah, I mean, in Jewish mysticism, there is a lot of influence of Shia mysticism, for instance. So, stop. Promise. Okay, next one.
So Noah's question, Jordy, about in Judaism, why do you mourn for life, or saying Kaddish or yard sites?
Right, and going off what Arwa was saying, thank you for saying that, Arwa, because I wanted to clarify. I don't mean like you're just going to be somber wearing black for like 365 days out of the year. When you mourn, as time goes on, it always changes. Like you mourn some way by going off like the favorite trail or on their hiking that they used to do and loving life. I'm just wondering, what's the philosophy behind that? I understand this is more of a philosophical question, and it's also subjective because no one answer is going to be correct. I just like your input on it.
In Judaism, we remember there are 3 times that we remember the people who passed away, which is going to be 3 holidays. I mean, it's related to that. What's the philosophy behind this? You mourn in communities. So basically, this is why we bring those prayers into the community context. For us, community is essential. We don't read the Torah if we don't have community. We don't do certain things if we don't have community. Remembering our death is if we don't remember our death if we don't have community, basically. What's the importance? differently from Islam, the emphasis is in the here and the now. That's the ethics. We don't know what's going to happen when we're going to die. We don't have a theology for the afterlife. And I'm serious. I mean, when you go through Talmud, you have to go to the idea that there is for the idea that you have a survival of the soul in the biblical text. You have to go to the intertestamental literature, into the books of Maccabees. That's the first time that you have a reference to the survival of the soul. After that, what this teaches us is it's a constant remembrance of what values those people who passed away taught me, how they have influenced my life, my mentors. I normally remember my mentor. My parents are alive, 120 years, but I normally remember my mentors because my mentors, I had two mentors in my life that really shaped my life. And for me, is this constant reminder of, this is what they taught me. Those are the values that guide my life. So it's the here and the now in Judaism. So that would be my take.
And the way we mourn is that, we have the week mourning is for the first 7 days, and you sit at home. The first month is also a protected time, and then the first year when prayers are said every day. But after that, on the anniversary of the death, every year for your whole life, you'll say the Kaddish prayer in community with 10 other Jewish people. And for Orthodox, it would be for 10 men. And for egalitarian streams, 10 either men or women. And and you say this prayer in remembrance of that person, and lighting a candle that lasts for 24 hours. But the prayer itself is in Aramaic, called the Kaddish, and it's more about praising life. And so that's another difference. And that's a sort of a simplified answer. Yeah. So now I think we're on to Zionism. The big question. And so Zionism is an idea that was developed in the middle of the 19th century in Central Europe at the same time that other nationalisms were developing in Germany, in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, in these places where the idea of a nation deserves to have its own boundaries, its own land. And that idea also came to influence Jewish thinkers, Theodor Herzl, in Central Europe. But of course, we also have a very, very long tradition of connection to the land of Israel, which was not broken even in diaspora. So there were Jewish people living in the place that we call the land of Israel, have lived there for thousands and thousands of years. Of course, when in the early 20th century, in the middle 20th century, it gets to be very conflictual with the other inhabitants of the area, in the Ottoman Empire, in the British Mandate of Palestine. And this is a very, very long and complicated history with lots, I could give you some books to read. But just trying to simplify things a little bit. But it's really the idea that Jewish people deserve to have a Jewish homeland. And they looked for other places, in a book list. Okay, I'm just reading your question, Heather. In Uganda, in other places where also, if we think about, there's an area just to the north of North Korea that Stalin wanted to, put Jews as well. But none of those places resonated with most of the Jewish world because of always, the remembrance of the land of Israel, Eretz Israel. And so, so people started to emigrate to what was then the Ottoman Empire. And some of the earliest ones were from Yemen, who walked Some of the very first immigrants walked from Yemen to the parts of the Ottoman Empire. And, you know, later it's very conflictual. I think you also have to think about the influence of the British Empire. And we look at many places in the British Empire where two religions conflicted. And we see some of the most intransient conflicts in those areas because they were so poorly managed. And yeah, but so that this is sort of basic stuff. Of course, later, after the Holocaust, then there's much more pressure to have Jews somewhere else, not in Europe. And it goes like that. But Rabbi Jordan, would you like to expound?
Yes, it's going to be time for another commercial. I have another book called Identities in Conflict that deals with that. So yes, I agree with Dr. Sara Koplik that Zionism is the place of birth of Zionism is Europe and the encounter of the Jewish community with modernity. The idea of citizenship is a modern idea, point number one. The idea of borders, who belongs. It's also the time when Germany becomes Germany at that point, it's still 15 different states that collide into one single state. Otto von Bismarck is the father of the modern Germany. So we have the birth of all these new lands, the birth of those borders and the concept of nationality. What the heck is a nation? Switzerland and United States are oddballs in this concept. What constitutes being an American? So that's a big question. So in the European mind is blood and land. And suddenly the Jew who lives in Germany says, one second, where do I belong? So suddenly that nationalistic European trend leaves that person totally orphan. That's why Zionism on one hand and migration to the United States in the other hand were forces during the 19th century, the end of the 19th century, that led Jewish migration towards one side or the other, because we're looking for a place where we can belong, because clearly that European nationalism pushes you out. Then I want to point out another thing. During the Ottoman Empire, for instance, during the expulsion of the Jews in 1492, we see the creation of, I'm not going to say a Jewish state or anything like this, but a Jewish place in Israel, in the Galilee area. That happened during the 1500s, and that was a flourishing moment that also had repercussions in Jewish liturgy. For instance, half of the Jewish liturgy for Friday night comes exactly from that period of time and from that place, from the Galil, from the Galilee Sea, from the Sfat. Probably you have heard about the location of Safed, S-A-F-E-D. That was kind of the noyau, the core of that community, and that was kind of a melech, a semi-independent, not semi-independent, but a core of Jewish presence in that part of the world during the Ottoman Empire under the Ottoman control. So that connection has been there for along the centuries. It has been a mythical connection, but then when you feel in the 19th century, when you feel like orphan, then you have a problem. For instance, 1850s, you have the Edict Crémieux. The French Republic grants citizenship to all the Jews in Algeria. When you have the Algerian independence, where do Jews go? Those Jews don't go to Israel. The majority of those Jews go to France, to the La Métropole, because they were granted that citizenship. On the other hand, you have Moroccan Jews that they go or to Israel or France or to in less amount to Spain. So you have two communities in the same area One is a protectorate, the other one is a department of the French Republic, and then you have two different responses for that people. For me, what counts is the historical situation, the geography, and the sense of being orphaned or not being orphaned, the sense of belonging.
Mm-hmm. And also, you know, we think about the 1,000 years of persecution in Europe, you know, culminating in genocide. And that was completely pushed out. So.
Okay, so we're about out of time. Thank you so much for trying to tackle what is really an impossible question in 10 minutes or less. Talk about Zionism. Good luck. I really appreciate the attempt and yeah, the efforts that you've had with us today, because we're about out of time here. So if anybody has any other questions, is it all right if I share your contact information if people want to continue this conversation or get more information about anything? Because an hour is not enough time to talk about Judaism.
Yes, and we, when, you know, anyone is always welcome to any Hillel event this year. They all have to be online because we're a student activity, but you're always welcome. If you're ever interested in Judaism, we're happy to explain things and welcome you. Always welcome. Everybody's welcome. And that's just who we are.
Shukran.
Shukran. I have a quick question for you, Abdullah. What about Islam in the mosque here? Are there still activities? Can people come, or is it better to wait until quarantine is over?
I think it's still quarantine, but now they have, but you know, like you have to call before, and they know how many people, especially in Friday, you know. But yeah, they have, like, it was one time, now they make it 2 times or 3 times to go to pray for Friday, you know.
Yeah, so if anyone wants to visit anything, because people are, I think there's this idea that we're all separate and nobody wants to talk about it, and almost born out of this fear. So, but people are really welcoming. So if anybody has any questions, please, happy to be a conduit to get to other people who are more knowledgeable about such things than I am.
Thank you, Heather, for your
Thank
time.
you so much for joining us today, everybody. I really appreciate it. Thank you for your time.
Thank you for your kindness.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Everybody, thank you so much.
Thank you
very much. Thank you.